This is Amro Hussain. I am Lou from Animal Rising, and Amro is from Humane Society International. We'll be speaking to us today about lobbying for animals, challenges and opportunities for policy change in the UK. Can we welcome Amro, please?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Thanks for coming to the talk today. I feel a little bit weird doing this talk on this stage, given the karaoke last night. I feel like I should be doing this in kind of a Lady Gaga voice, but for your sake, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges and opportunities that there exist in the UK political landscape at the moment for policy change for animals. Focusing a wee bit on the short term with the upcoming election, but also pointing to a few bits and pieces for more long-term consideration. So we'll start with the big question. Who's ready for an election? Huh? Hey. Oh, I love that. That excitement's palpable. You're almost excited as these lads. But you should be. It's an exciting time in politics. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the political landscape, talk a bit about the election scope, but also kind of the political landscape for animals, because that's why we're here. I'm also then going to move on from that to speak about the challenges that exist for policy change, how can we approach some of these challenges, some of the opportunities that are arising out of the moment, and again, how we as a sector and as individuals maximize these opportunities. And here's just a picture of a nice pig, because why not? And if you can't put pictures of nice animals at a vegan animal rights conference presentation, when can you do it? So let's talk about the current political landscape. As we all know, we're going to have an election very soon. The Dissolution and Calling of Parliaments Act allows the Prime Minister, a bit ridiculously, to call it whenever he wants, which will be when it's most politically advantageous, but he has to do it before January 2025. So the smart money is that the election is going to be on in autumn sometime. He might choose to call it in June or July if it's more advantageous, but all the polls look towards a comfortable Labour victory. It's all been kind of, as you'll know, around 20 points percentage margin, all pointing to a huge landslide for Labour. Even a bit of polling that was just done, an MRP poll at the end of March, predicted an absolute wipeout, catastrophic results for the Tory party. Now, you have to take these with like a little pinch of salt, because polls tend to narrow closer towards elections. And also, you know, as an Irish person living in the UK, I feel like one of the UK's favourite pastimes is voting Tory. So I'm kind of finding it hard to imagine that it's going to be such a wipeout. But all the signs point to Rishi not being as excited as he was. So that's the kind of just general political background that we're talking about. And here's a cute bunny. But let's talk about some of the kind of the political context over the last few years and kind of the opportunities there. So at times, I guess it feels like there's been no progress being made for animals at all, because we all, you know, there's not enough happening, and there's such a volume and enormous amount of suffering, both in the UK and globally. But there have been some kind of bits of progress that we've seen in the political landscape recently. So the passing of the Animal Sentience Act, for example, and a number of other things that I've just quickly jotted down here, like bans on glue traps, bans on snares in Scotland and Wales, tougher sentencing, bans on advertising of low welfare animal activities abroad. So for example, preventing people from advertising elephant rides and things like that in other countries. Anything that we wouldn't allow in the UK for welfare reasons you're banned to advertise that. And there's a number of bills kind of currently going through Parliament, ban on live exports, a pet smuggling bill, and hopefully a ban on trophy hunting. You know, it's not the transformational change that we all desperately want, but there's some things happening. And, you know, it's easy to dismiss something like things like glue traps and snares, but the estimates on how many animals are caught in snares in the UK every year are about 2 million animals caught in a very painful and damaging trap. So it's good to see some progress in these areas. Unfortunately, we've also seen a lot of setbacks and a lot of U-turning from the government. There was the quite relatively progressive action plan for animal welfare that was published that had a lot clear strategy and ideas for how to advance on a number of important issues. That was abandoned. The Kept Animals Bill was an important flagship bill that focused on a lot of key animal issues, also dropped, same with the Animals Abroad Bill. There's consultations gathering dust. For example, the government consulted on banning the importation of fur. Nothing's happening with that. They were all set to go on consulting on banning cages for laying hens in the UK. That all fell by the wayside as well. There's been watering down of commitments. For example, I mentioned on the last slide that we did successfully get a licensing system for keeping primates as pets, but that was supposed to be a ban, and the government kind of watered it down. Essentially, what we've been seeing is, because of the turmoil within the Conservative Party and the change when Boris Johnson was ousted, new kind of administration came in that just isn't really interested in animal stuff, which leaves you in kind of the queasy position of kind of, reminiscing fondly about this person for the sake of animals. But that's the position we're in, and I'm going to speak now a little bit about the challenges and that have kind of fed into that situation. So there's lots of different challenges. We're going to speak about a few relatively high-level ones. The first one is just the economic situation. War in Ukraine, rising grain prices, extraordinary cost of living crisis, pressure on farmers, pressure on consumers. It makes it difficult for a government to introduce policy change or to talk about anything if there is a conceivable risk that it's going to put more pressure on consumers and businesses. And even beyond that, even when there are things that mightn't necessarily actually have a cost impact associated with them, the government are just very queasy, and politicians across the board, about speaking about things that might make them seem a little bit out of touch. For example, if they start talking about animal stuff and people are like, who cares about that? We want to talk about cost of living. That's not necessarily going to happen, but politicians are very wary about that and feel a bit concerned about it. So there's the economic angle. There's also Brexit as a big issue. There are some benefits of Brexit for animal protection. It gives control over border policies that can allow things like an import ban on fur or bans on trophy hunting, that kind of thing, or a ban on live exports. And these were really kind of magnified by people who were pro-leave, who said, we're going to be able to do all this stuff. But unfortunately, the sad reality of Brexit and of leaving the single market is that to make Brexit work on some level, the government has to be going out and trying to secure trade deals to compensate for what was lost. So they're going to be willing to sign trade deals that have low animal welfare standards, or with countries who have low animal welfare standards. And we've seen that. They've signed a number of trade deals that have kind of sold out both animals and farmers. So that's kind of an issue, and not just an issue for Conservative government. Even if Labour have been criticising them for that behaviour, but even if Labour comes in, it's very difficult for them to not do something similar as well. So that is a real restriction on what they can do in terms of policy change. And the last challenge I really want to speak about today is kind of the culture war stuff, the tiresome stoking of divisions to try and kind of win votes, particularly on environmental stuff. What David Cameron called kind of cutting the green crap. And we were in the ridiculous situation at the Conservative Party conference this year of the former Environment Minister making an impassioned speech about fake meat being for astronauts, but not for real British people, and that kind of thing, and talking about green zealots who think our farmers should stop rearing livestock. And that kind of thing, I mean, sometimes you hear about it and you listen to it and it seems just absurd, really, particularly in the state of a climate emergency that we're in. But to be honest, it's been fairly effective. People and parties are wary and a wee bit hesitant about specifically talking about things like meat reduction and that kind of thing. I've even spoken to Green Party officials in Green Party who are a little bit tentative about talking about kind of meat reduction and stuff because the opposition have been so effective in kind of demonising and stigmatising that area. So that is a big challenge for policy change. So we have challenges, and you can be a little bit despondent about these, and sometimes it can be a bit disheartening, but there are things that we can do to try and approach these challenges and still achieve significant policy change. And sometimes when we talk about this, it gets discussed as kind of being aspirational versus being realistic about what we can achieve. And I think that's slightly wrong, because I think we can be aspirational and we can be realistic. And I think actually we have to be to achieve aspirational goals. We need to set goals and ideals that are big, that will have change, but we need to be realistic about where we are currently. We need to really understand the context. We need to accurately determine the barriers to our policy aims and develop strategies which methodically address them, even if it means taking more long-term approaches. So I was very heartened to hear Layla's fantastic talk yesterday, thinking about the long-term strategy and approach to how we can achieve the transformational change that we want to see. And crucially, in all this, particularly when it comes to policy change, just being alive to opportunities and being alive to the fact that what is politically feasible at any given time can change dramatically. So to not get so stuck in our minds about we can't achieve this now, so we shouldn't do it. Things can change very, very quickly. And I'm going to point to the example of the proliferation of free market think tanks. So this is quite an interesting podcast that Politico did if you want to learn more about it. But it was essentially about free market think tanks just pumping out research, proliferating their ideas, going to MPs, just building over a long time an agenda, putting out their agenda of what they wanted to see in terms of economic policy, even when politicians weren't really ready to go for it. And then in this particular case, this kind of culminated with Boris resigning, there being dramatic change, and one of their disciples, who they'd been kind of buttering up and working with over years, Liz Truss, coming to power. Obviously, that didn't work out very well. It didn't last very long. But you have a group of people from the outside who got someone who was championing their values at the very highest position of office in the country. And there's lots of other examples of think tanks and neoliberal economists all doing this, waiting for an opportunity to strike and doing the groundwork and then taking advantage of that. And we need to kind of take a lesson from that too, I think. So speaking about these challenges, I just wanted to give a little bit of a case study of a recent kind of policy change that Humane Society International were involved in, and that is the successful campaign to ban the dog meat trade in South Korea. Now, so you might not be aware of this, but the South Korean government parliament voted to ban the dog meat industry in January of this year. A little bit of context about the industry is about 1 million dogs being factory farmed every year and killed in quite brutal methods, most often electrocution, but even hanging sometimes. But that bill has been passed now, and there's going to be a 3-year industry phase out, but from 2027 it will be illegal to breed and slaughter dogs for human consumption. Now, there are a lot of barriers to this campaign. I mean, it is obviously very different from kind of the factory farming that we're talking about because of the scale of the numbers. And also, in South Korea, it wasn't a situation where the vast majority of the public were routinely eating dog meat. It was more kind of an older generation of people who had traditional beliefs about it affecting health and that kind of thing. But it was still a very difficult kind of goal and a very aspirational goal to try and achieve. And there's some of the campaigners in Korea from HSI Korea said, really didn't believe that they began campaigning in 2014 and they didn't believe in 10 years the industry was going to be gone. And some of them didn't really believe necessarily in their lifetime it was going to be gone. Because when they started trying to engage with politicians and political figures, they didn't want to hear about it. They didn't want to talk about it for various reasons, the traditional cultural points. But principally, I suppose, because of the economic situation. They didn't want to kind of upset farmers. They didn't want to engage with that or to be seen to kind of taking steps that might harm the farming vote. So seeing that, we had there was an aspirational goal to change and get rid of the industry, but we had to recognize the barrier that existed there, look at the economics and try and strategically and methodically respond to that barrier. And so we started looking at, and HSI Korea started looking at, was what are the other economic models? How can we transition from this? Can we do the research? Can we work to develop a plan and a strategy for how we can go forward from this industry and hope that there's opportunities that we can capitalize on so that we can make this change? And the opportunity that really kind of came out from this work was that the fact that there were just lots and lots of farmers who didn't want to be in this industry anymore. And so we were able to develop the Models for Change kind of program, which is essentially working with farmers, getting them to sign a contract to say that they were willing to give up their farm as long as they were able to help them transition into other industries. So I have examples like water parsley farming, blueberry farming, kind of non-animal farming businesses. And that really changed things in terms for South Korean policymakers, because suddenly they were shown that this policy change wasn't going to come in conflict with farmers, but there was actually the space for cooperation. And that changed the ability to talk about it. But that was still about working methodically and then capitalizing on an opportunity that arose. So to summarize that, having a clear aspirational goal, but really couching it in a realistic assessment of the context, then developing a strategic response based on those barriers and how you're going to tackle them, being willing to take a long-term approach if that was necessary, not assuming that it has to come in a very short-run space. And also, of course, just being ready to capitalize on those opportunities. Policy change is so much about that. We need to be live to that. So having the thing up there like that kind of seems almost that it's, you just do these steps and policy change, yay, great. But I think it's worth noting that policy change just really isn't linear, and we have to kind of bear that in mind. It doesn't go up like this graph. It's much more like, I think, snakes and ladders. You do your work, you prepare, you take your steps up the board, you might kind of engage with your MPs, and hey, who knows, right? Your MP that you've worked with, that you've developed this relationship with, he suddenly becomes a minister in DEFRA, and you have kind of a foot in there. So that's you going up the ladder. But then you're doing a bit more work, and I don't know, he gets caught doing cocaine with P. Diddy or something, and then he goes down the snakes, and then you're back where you started. But that's kind of how it has to be. And that was, definitely HSI's experience when it comes to the ban on glue traps. So we'd done the work, had been campaigning for years on it, doing the research, engaging with parliamentarians. But how the bill actually came to be successful in the end was that one MP got selected in a ballot for private members' bills and was like, I'm going to champion this because we'd done the relationship. And then that person took it forward and we got the ban. Conceivably, if that MP hadn't wanted to take that forward, that one person, we still wouldn't have the ban right now. So we just had to be ready for that opportunity as it came up. So I want to talk about this kind of approach and this way of responding to challenges in the context of something that we obviously all care deeply about, which is ending factory farming. Obviously, I think we can understand that ending intensive farming just now, having some kind of legislation that will just ban factory farming, is politically infeasible in the immediate term, short run. And so the kind of response of most of the animal protection organizations in this country has been to target the worst abuses of factory farming, do what you can now, ending the cage age, introduce the BCC, that kind of thing, and to see that as a stepping stone towards getting rid of factory farming as a whole. And I think that's important, and that is a smart and strategic response. I just think that perhaps we've kind of lost sight a little bit of the overall goal and of taking steps towards that overall goal. Like, have we been assessing the context and the barriers and the limitations and the things that we can target to change factory farming? Do we have a strategy that will respond to that? So do we have all the research? Do we know exactly what it looks like when we transition from a post-factory farming world? Do we know what that will look like in terms of food production, food consumption? Are we doing that ground setting work? Are we building the political support? Are we talking to MPs about, factory farming? And we might worry, for example, and with good reason, that, okay, if you go to an MP now and you talk to them, I want to ban factory farming tomorrow, that you're going to get laughed out of the room. And that's true. And so we should be wary about that. We don't want to diminish our credibility. But can we talk to MPs about banning factory farming by 2045 or something, or by 2050? Will they be more open to that? Will they be willing to let go some of the short-term political fears and interests? So, they're likely not going to be in politics or in power at that time, so maybe they'll be a bit more open to it. There's just ways of thinking about how we can look at this strategy in a long-term way that I think we might be missing a little bit, and we kind of really need that to think about how we're going to get to where we need to go. And I don't think necessarily we're doing that at the moment. And it's also just important to say as well that not all organizations need to take the same approach. I just want to reiterate that. So it is kind of good that some organizations now are maybe saying end factory farming tomorrow, because that then creates some space for kind of more friendly facing organizations to speak to MPs and be like, okay, well, maybe we're not doing that, but how can we work together to move forward? So there is space for a broad church. Why not? So that's kind of the challenges and the way to, a way and a method to kind of approach those challenges. But I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the opportunities that exist as well. Obviously, there are a lot of different opportunities, but I want to speak in kind of a bit of the short term, focusing on the political landscape and the election. As I said, we're likely going to have a new government and a Labour government. And you know, it remains to be seen how progressive the Labour government is going to be, particularly on animal protection policies. They haven't said very much publicly. That's true of nearly all policy issues, to be fair as well. But they've mentioned that they're going to try and tidy up the loopholes in the Hunting Act, that they're interested in kind of like trophy hunting and things like that. But really, they haven't given any kind of indication of what they will do. But what I have put up on here is just a number of things that there's been significant progress in already, or the political groundwork has been done, or that we're kind of close towards getting through, that are all, I think, very feasible within the next parliamentary term, that again aren't necessarily the enormous transformational change that we want, but could have a huge impact for animals. So the Hunting Act loopholes, like I said, Labour are probably going to do that and have kind of, I think, have committed to do that publicly. But there's also things like method of production labelling. So there's a consultation about that now, trying to find out how we can do animal welfare labeling on products. And that's something that could be hugely transformational, really. When we think about the effect that having clear labeling about cage systems has done on free-range production in this country, having very clear animal welfare method of production labeling could be very dramatic in its impact for how people see factory farming and animal agriculture in this country. Public procurement, there is work going on within the government now to try and see how government spending can be done to promote environmental interests, but also animal welfare interests. There is scope for funding for farmers to be increased to help them to do positive animal protection changes. There, for example, the Better Chicken commitment is on the DEFRA's website as a thing that they are going to be willing to fund. The funding isn't really there yet, and it's very difficult to access it, but these are things that can have a really huge impact that in the next few years. And so that's, you know, generally speaking, what we might see from a new government coming in. But I think it's really important to emphasize the unique kind of nature of this specific election. So that little graphic on the side, and that's taken from February. That's all the MPs who are standing down at this election, and that was like 60 odd. And I think since then, another 30 odd people have gone. So even if there were no other changes, if the election isn't changed, even if Labour didn't win, there's still going to be at least 100 more new MPs. And if the polling is as big and change as some people are predicting, we're going to have hundreds of new MPs, the biggest change since 2010. And some are predicting the biggest change in a cohort of MPs since World War II. It might not turn out to be that case, but what we do know is that we'll have hundreds of new people who we can potentially engage to really champion animal protection issues. So how can we maximize these opportunities of the change in government and these new parliamentary figures? What I really want to emphasize is really investing in candidate and MP engagement. That's true for organizations and for the sector, but it's also true for individuals. Trying to really engage with your candidates here. The shape and makeup of the candidates who come in on these issues is going to have a huge impact for animals, both in the short run and the long run. Potentially, like these MPs could be in for 10, 15 years, potentially. So really developing good relationships with these people could have enormous impact for animals. And I think there's a talk later today, I think Claire from the Vegan Society is going to be speaking about how to engage with candidates. So I'm not going to get into that now, but I will just give one reminder that I like to give all the time, which is speak to their interests. when you're speaking to an MP or a political party, always remember kind of, it's difficult for us sometimes as people who are so passionate about the cause and who see so clearly the enormity of the injustice to think that everyone should just get it. Really, they should, but they don't. So sometimes we need to couch things in their language and understand what are the political interests of a specific candidate in a constituency and a specific political party. So always remember to think about what are they getting out of this discussion? What can you offer? And so the other part I really want to emphasize on maximizing these opportunities is collaboration and building networks. So we've been doing a lot more of this in the animal protection sector, and it's really encouraging to see. And I've put this poster from the Better Deal for Animals campaign, which was kind of a coalition that developed in response to Brexit and around Brexit of lots of different organizations coming together, calling for MPs to commit to animal protection. And there's, a lot of the organizations I think will be on Basecamp, which is a platform that people are using increasingly to, if you have a letter that you're writing to a minister, to put it out there and ask other organizations and individuals to sign it. And that way we can kind of amplify our voice and messaging and be less kind of isolated organizations asking for a million different things, but trying to coordinate our voice to amplify it so it really cuts through. And we're doing this as well even with kind of the manifestos for the election. So HSI and other organizations have been going to each of the different political parties and giving them an agenda for animal protection as a unified front to say, this is what we want to see. And again, it kind of gets us past that thing of thinking like, a party hearing from 50 different organizations about what they want to see for animal protection and all being different things. It's very hard then to decipher what should be the most important thing, what you should go for. But if you get lots of organizations together in a room and say, this is what we want, this is what we think is good, that is much easier for a political party to take up. And we're seeing some progress in that from some of the parties at the moment. Another example of a thing that we're trying to get off the ground for this election is kind of Votes for Animals campaign. So this is a little shot from a website that will be redone for this election. And kind of the idea behind this website and this campaign is to try and get some agreement from the sector loosely on a number of animal protection pledges that we can kind of unify around and then go to candidates about. So things like transitioning away from factory farming, things like appointing an animal welfare commissioner, that the Hunting Act, those kind of things. Trying to, again, do that work of solidifying and collaborating and unifying over a single set of pledges so we all go out to candidates together. So every person who's standing for office in this country feels like, okay, these are the things I need to get behind. There's so much support behind this and makes it easy for them to champion our causes if they're elected. Now, those kind of points are a bit. So the things I'm describing are a bit kind of the larger organizations mostly have kind of been involved in so far. But I would really want to emphasize that there's a lot of scope for not only individuals, but also smaller organizations to get involved with this kind of general large-scale policy making. So, there are so many animal shelters or animal rights organizations and universities and things like that I think could be really brought in that we haven't kind of folded in necessarily into the movement to capitalize on. So, for example, as HSI, we can go to a candidate for an election and be like, okay, we want you to stand up for these things for animals. And that's relatively compelling, but it's not as compelling as having a few organizations from that person's constituency contacting them and particularly coming together. And not even just necessarily organizations, but like I said, individuals. Sometimes it feels like MPs aren't listening and stuff. But even if, for example, if they're from a political party that you don't support or they don't really stand for your issues. But if you go as a group of people who are passionate and you meet with your MP and collectively say, we care about these issues, even if he or she is diametrically kind of opposed to the issues, they'll be wary about kind of just vocally opposing them. So, I mean, even that kind of thing, even mitigating just some of the resistance that parliamentarians might have can be really helpful for the movement. But genuinely, coming together and having a coordinated network of smaller organizations all pushing for the same policies to MPs across the country could have a really transformative effect. And to give a kind of an example of this kind of work, I'm just going to highlight the Open Wing Alliance, which I think many of you will be aware of, which was doing this kind of work, but doing it with organizations around the world who are campaigning for cage-free policies or the Better Chicken Commitment, that kind of thing. And it was upskilling the organizations, coordinating the network, giving them the skills they need to lobby against corporations. And that has had huge results from getting, again, unifying us, getting the skills from bigger organizations to smaller organizations and working together on issues. And I think we can do that in the policy sphere as well. So the final thing I wanted to speak about in kind of collaboration is just looking outside of the traditional spaces that we often do. So it's, I've been speaking about animal protection organizations here, but there's lots of different opportunities out there. So to give the example of the Plant-Based Food Alliance, that it has animal protection organizations involved in it, but also has businesses. I think like Oatly is involved, or Alpro, those kind of things, looking to where we can make coalitions and networks beyond our usual spheres of influence. And I've put the NFU, the National Farmers Union, up here. You would that isn't typically where we go. But if you think about something like the trade deals issue and the issue, farmers are being just as affected by that as our organizations are, because they're being undercut by cheaper imports from other countries. So there is a potential there to build networks and to work collaboratively on there to make sure that core animal welfare standards are included in all trade deals that the government sign. And that's something that we would support and that the NFU would definitely support as well. And really, when I'm talking about this collaboration stuff, really what I'm talking about, a big chunk of it, is communicating public support for the public support that exists for animals. We know that there is a lot of it, even beyond cats and dogs. People, when they're polled, care about these issues, but we haven't managed to capture political figures in the same way, for example, the agricultural lobby has. So there's a lot of work to try and translate that political support. So to quickly sum up, there are challenges for menacing policy change, but that doesn't mean it should prevent us from achieving and pursuing our policy goals. We just need to be pragmatic, strategic, pounce on opportunities, and be resilient, because policy change is not a linear process. There are also lots of opportunities coming up, and particularly opportunities afforded by this general election to make change for animals. And to maximize this opportunity, we need to invest in candidate engagement and really work collaboratively and intelligently across the sector to translate public support for animal protection. So to finish up, here's just another picture of animals, and happy to take any questions.